conveying something to me or judging me and giving me a grade. It has to do with a kind of chemistry that goes between two people. And I just think that generally instructors are more interesting when you get them in their own context. Their own houses generally, to me, kind of magnify those interesting aspects of their personality, whether or not you like them. And so I said, why don't we do, since there's no instructor housing out here, why don't we do a kind of apartment residential community which can kind of be studios and teaching places, and let them hold some classes in this and just have this all kind of around. Give them some space so that if they want to get away from the school and want to get away from students, they can shut their door or shut a patio off or something. But I said, don't provide all of this administrative headquarters sort of thing. Now, that was kind of probably taking it to an extreme, because you know as well as I do that a faculty has to get together from time to time and really focus on what they're going to do as a group. But I just didn't get anywhere with that idea. And I still think that is something that might have merit.
In line with that, did you know off the top the percentage of actual usable teaching space or studio space to corridors or anything else? Do you know what you ended up with out of the 300,000?
Well, yes, the federal government has a very elaborate form which you have to fill out, which is used by the California Coordinating Council to qualify you on whether you get funds. And the whole game there is to prove that your building is efficient. And if you are in the higher area of efficiency, what you then do is that you get the funds before somebody else does. That's the way it works. We were, as I recall, about 73% efficient in that building. And that has to do with teaching space. And that, I know I've heard the numbers going around that we were something like 50% efficient out there. And I was talking to Bill Lund, who was the president of the school, about this. And I said, Bill, you know, that number, wherever that number came from, just isn't true. So I went back and I dug out, this was maybe a year ago, and I dug out the old government forms and I looked them up, and I think, as I recall, it was about 73%. And they don't even allow you to take into consideration storage closets.
I think it appears
Yeah.
a little less. Maybe
Yeah.
What do you do in your volumetric spaces? You just count the floor area at one time, or you only count usable floor?
You count usable floor, yeah.
Just another practical type. When you're back on federal funding, first of all, I wasn't aware, of course, not from the university book at all, but that there was much federal funding in private institutions like this, so that there is federal funding for these uses, but it's not just.
Oh, yes. Yes, as a matter of fact, when we were going in for the major funding on the school, and incidentally, the applications for the funding went in several different times. When we went in for the major funding on the school, there were many other institutions around after money. And the reason I remember that efficiency as being so crucial was that the coordinating council gave CalArts that large sum of money, or approved that large sum of money, because the efficiency was so high compared to all the other people.
There were a lot of restraints that were put upon you because of the federal involvement.
Yeah.
Right? You stated that. And I was just wondering, was Disney behind this whole operation? Why private funding wasn't used in lieu of federal funding in terms of probably allowing more flexibility, more freedom in what could be done, less of the restrictions that normally go with the federal.
Well, first of all, I don't think the federal government put maybe as many restraints on as perhaps I've suggested. It's hard for me to evaluate that. The second thing is that Disney said, if he said it 10 times, he said it 100, I guess. That he said, the problem is if I get behind this school, everybody will expect me to pay for it. And he said, I don't have that kind of money. And as a matter of fact, he didn't have that kind of money. The only reason that school has Disney support now was because that money was released when he died, you see, but it wasn't released until his death.
The foundation supports
Yes.
about half of
Yes. Right. So at the time that he was alive, he was very worried about how he was going to hack it. And it's darn hard to go out and raise 10, 12, 15 million dollars. Look at the sweat to do the music center alone.
That seems kind of strange because at least I got the idea from discussing it beforehand, that in the original program phase, one of the reasons why all of these progressive ideas were discussed at all is that the funding is that they were trying to promote a feeling that you shouldn't be restricted by finances at all. And my understanding was that that was because Disney was behind it and they would come up with the money somehow to promote the artistic activities no matter how far out, because the kind of school they wanted to build was something that was very progressive and, you know, from their standpoint, probably something that everyone would want to look at and fund. And when you discuss things that you had to cut back on because of funding, it doesn't seem congruous with the ideas that I had about the way the school got started as far as the money was concerned.
We were given the impression that there was no limit to the amount of funds available for innovative programs, and that was the impression given by representatives of the Disney family. Simply, there was no limit.
Who said that? Oh. Did Mark say that?
Well, he said that was the impression
That was
he
the
was
impression
given.
they were getting,
Well,
even though
they were
were
getting.
asking the-
Well, I tell you, I think that Mort may, I have great respect for Mort, really. I think
Well,
that,
he agrees with
Yeah.
with your attitude about how the bracket is.
yeah, he probably,
He felt that he gave the same kind of.
well, you see, Mort was really brought in under the Corrigan Blau era, and I think that it may very well have been that the demise of the Corrigan Blau era stemmed from the fact that the board, which is of trustees, of which the Disneys, of course, are a part, felt that the Corrigan Blau people were not sufficiently concerned about the bottomless pit that was supposed to be there in terms of money. And it would be perfectly understandable to me how the faculty under an administration like that could get the impression that there was no limit. But I never got that impression.
Well, in the programming, weren't they all brought in? I mean, how was the programming done? It wasn't just Corrigan Blau talking to you and the board. Were not faculty members were brought in too, or were they not involved?
No, the faculty, the main structure of the programming was conceived, the main outlines of the programming was conceived before the faculty was brought aboard. See, the faculty, there was a 2-year period in which faculty was built, and every time that a new person came in, then the details of that department were looked into, but the broad picture in which all that fitted had already more or less been structured.
Who were the main people involved with establishing that pay structure? Just Mr. Disney and the board?
The main people, the Board of Trustees, really there were lots of people. There were so many forces moving. There was all that early research work that I had done, for instance, and the conservatory had done. And then there was the whole Mr. Disney himself. Then there was the whole Chenard people who'd had many years in which they'd been teaching. And we had certain people in the Conservatory of Music who had their effect. Then we had Blau individually. Then we had Corrigan individually. And then he began to build his staff of deans. And then each dean had his influence on it. Then you had the board, individual members of the board of trustees who, in their particular area of expertise, put in their oar. You had a lot of consultants that were hired at that time. Lots of people came in, and all had their inputs.
And how did you relate to all of these? I mean, were you relating to all of these people, or to some of them, or how did you?
Most all of them, yeah. And you see, one of the problems was that we were so far committed in some instances as these latecomers that were being added to the faculty came aboard, that we had a problem, and that is if they said, well, I need a 24-foot stainless steel developing tray, what was I going to do? You know, how many rooms can you put 24-foot developing tray in? So I had to rework areas as best I could, trying to use some judgment and reason as to how much money to spend. And this had to go back and forth, and the new estimates and new budgets and new reviews always had to go back to the board and so on.
Keeping with this whole budgetary thing, I have to get back to the maintenance question. From what we've understood from talking to people who teach there and such, it costs about $1 million a year just to keep the building under control, you know, like climate control and maintenance and everything else. And I'm just wondering, if there was such a tight budgetary, or there was such a strong budgetary consideration, were thoughts of how, you know, yearly, how that maintenance was going to be covered? Because apparently the student's tuition doesn't cover that entire cost.
Well, let me try to answer your question in two parts. First of all, the CalArts as a structure gets very, very high marks in terms of energy consumption. That building has been written up in a number of energy articles in air conditioning magazines and things like that. That building really is very economical to run in terms of energy. And there's some very interesting reasons why that happened. As a matter of fact, if you ever wanted to have somebody discuss that with you, our mechanical engineer, I think if you ever have a course in that sort of thing, can give you lots of interesting information on that. The maintenance per square foot of that building, if compared to other buildings, is very economical. And the fact that, I don't know where you got this $1 million.
It's half, actually. If you don't count air conditioning, I mean, they have about that much staff in terms of janitorial.
It's quite, it's very economical. It probably isn't adequate either, the budget. But I've checked into that because I was concerned about it. And so you'll have to, if you don't believe me, you'll have to go around and check other buildings of comparable size. But you will find that it is very economical. $500,000 sounds like a lot of money, but so is 300,000 square feet sound like a lot of space.
Primary problem here was the fact that the lack of students, because it only had like 600 students and it was designed for 2,000, wasn't forming an economic base to maintain the physical plant.
This is absolutely, of course. I mean, that goes without saying.
Yet in their own evaluation of this point, they don't see, they don't want to increase, according to what somebody else said, that the increase would cause added expenses. They don't have enough room for more than 600 students, which, you know, seems pretty strange if you look at it.
Well, I don't think it has to do with the physical plant. What this has to do is with that subtle relationship between size of class and size of department and personnel and student relationships. If you add another 600 people, you don't add 600 more people. And if you double I suspect that what they're saying is that if they double the population there, they will probably double their expenses, or more than double their expenses.
Well, there are, maybe, because I think they're, my question is
Yeah.
administrative setup. I mean, that, they're set up like for 5,000 students in a college system. I mean,
Yeah.
administratively, the way I look
Yeah.
at it, I mean, we compare, you know, our operation and the Cal State system, and it just seems like they're way over in that area. And of course, like you say, if they double, they'll, I've seen figures, the president alone figures he needs an increase of $25,000 a year if they had 300 students.
Ray, I suggest you put together a proposal to go out there and streamline their administration. I don't mean that. I'm serious about that.
It's like everything else. It started in red and cold.
Yeah,
Right. Well,
right.
I've heard people who've been in on that whole
Yeah.
thing try to talk to that issue, and that's the one thing that they put aside and they're trying to cut in other areas, which is
Incidentally, forgotten who was it over somewhere over here asked me a question earlier. Maybe it was you. Asked me a question that, and this relates to it, and that is that early on, when I began to see how big this thing was becoming, and had some concern about, considerable concern about whether they were biting off more than they could chew, I said to the administration, and this was to Corrigan, I said, I haven't seen an operating budget for this school as yet. Now, it's not really my business to see it, except insofar as your concerns on air conditioning and things, plant maintenance. But I haven't seen an operating budget, and it would seem to me that it would be well to do it, because when you talk about theater productions, and this was all in the whole theater area that this whole subject came up, you've got a shop there that's going to require, and you've got enough theaters to require a continual construction program which involves 30 or 40 people, physical bodies building things. Now, where are you going to get the money to buy all the materials to put in the hands of the people that are going to be building all these things for all the productions you're going to be putting on? This is just an immense amount of money, because you are not going to be able to get enough student time contributed to be able to be the equivalent of 30 or 40 bodies in a carpentry shop or a paint shop or costume shop or whatever. And I pressed that issue time and time again, and somehow that just never got put into focus.
Of course, that became the problem with the modular theater, so it started to one
Right.
problem. The other one I wanted to ask about that, on the modular theater, was there became the question then, you know, as you raised each module, you had the infill, the four sides, and I was just, with all the expense in the hydraulics, I was just wondering why these weren't designed in such a way as it went up, the enclosure didn't have to be in place, so that you had more flexibility.
I'm sorry, I don't understand about the infilling.
Well, each flat, the way I understood it, because we didn't see it, we
Yes.
saw it flat, but each panel is 4 by 4 and
Yes.
flat. As it raises, they then had to fill in 2, 3, 4, whatever number of sides, so that people wouldn't fall through, right?
No, that isn't true. They have to have
Someone said
railings.
that.
We have to have railings when a platform drops off to another level. But that has nothing to do with filling in. No, there's no filling in that has to happen there.
Somebody said that, didn't they?
On the individual modules on the actual floor, when they raise up, there isn't any infill on the edge?
No.
You just see the hydraulic
Yeah.
cylinder.
Right.
Was it,
In operation, like that, because we were
Oh, sure.
described differently.
Yeah.
Those are square shafts, all enclosed.
Oh, I lived that. Half of my gray hair is modular from here over is modular theater.
I should agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the reason given to us that it wasn't used, the tremendous cost to change it, and you have all the things that you talked about, the number of people involved in the change was greater than the cost, which I imagine, which I guess.
I don't really know that, incidentally, I don't think the changing problems in the modular theater are the major problems. I think that if you really were to do a production list and put all the people down that had to contribute to that production and put the amount of time, I think you'd find that the changing of the levels of the platforms was relatively small than maybe what you have in your mind. And particularly if you put alongside of it the cost that it would cost you to produce the same thing in a conventional theater, because there are some costs in any theater. Modular theater is an extremely flexible and easy to light theater. And anybody that's been in the lighting business is going to tell you how many hours and hours and hours it takes to light a production. It's a lot of man hours. And the way that grid system, catwalk system works, you can go in there and in a very, very short period of time light just anything. So you may spend a few hours raising a few platforms, but you're going to well make up for it in the whole lighting system.
So then what stopped it from being used, let's hear it from you, being used as originally envisioned? I know even changes during performances, things happening, the whole
Well,
the way we understand it, it's sort of set up once or twice a year,
yeah.
and it sort of stays in.
I think it's, I don't know the accurate answer to that question. I have to qualify that. I can tell you why I think probably it hasn't been. First of all, there has to be some relationship, it seems to me, between the degree of sophistication and polish of the actor's capabilities and the amount of time that it's worth putting on a production. In other words, you don't take first-year students and go in and put on a big production in the modular theater because it isn't worth it. They aren't good enough, frankly. When you get fourth and fifth year theater students who have really mastered acting to a large extent, and all of the theatrical aspects of the thing are up to keyed up to make it worth starting to put on a production, then you can start think of using the theater. This is also true of the lighting staff. It's true of the costuming, the scenery, design, all the rest of it. I think that in CalArts, in the first 3 years that they were out there, they really didn't have all that many people that were that expert, frankly. I know that Herb Blau didn't envision any major performances in that theater for 5 years. Now, number two, I think that you have you just have a number of body problems. In other words, how many people, how many physical hands have you got in those students that are majoring in design, theater design, available to contribute their time to doing the work? I don't know how many they have, but certainly out of 600, I don't imagine you'd have more than 3 or 4, total population of 600, you'd have more than 3 or 4 people in terms of theater design. Well, no, they can't go out and build scenery, and they can't go out and move the platforms and do the lighting and all the rest of it. There just aren't enough bodies. So I don't think it's so much a fault of the theater, really, as these other constraints.
Yeah, I would support that in our experience with theaters. In the Concord thing, we have a theater in the round, possibly. And the Panos came with the San Francisco Ballet 2 weeks ago. And the whole performance could have been done in the round. But instead they put up these little baffles. And you were sitting looking at the performers going through the little baffle before he came on stage. It was so ridiculous, but it was a conventional attitude. I mean, the theater people aren't all that way out. You know, there's very few of them that know how to deal with something like this.
You're absolutely right, Frank. And you know, the extraordinary thing to me is that I've run into some very imaginative people in this whole CalArts encounter. Some extraordinarily talented and imaginative people. But I find that in many instances they're compartmented in their imagination and their creativity. And that if you get them out of their creative field, they're absolutely square in another field. They just cannot bridge across to these other areas. And this was a totally unexpected thing to me. And they're really unimaginative and quite incapable of knowing what to do.
Were you aware of, at the time of programming and conceptualizing the design of this and everything, were you aware of the Gruen plan for Valencia? And if so, how did you expect the school to take a part in that whole master plan?
Yes, we were aware of the Gruen plan. And as a matter of fact, we had a number of meetings with in Gruen's offices about where the campus would work best. And that ultimate decision had to be made really by Newhall Land and Farming in Gruen's office, which is what it eventually was.
Do you think that Valencia has contributed or detracted from the school or not done anything environmentally as far as the whole area is concerned?
It's very hard for me to say because I really haven't been privy to the interaction, if any, between Valencia and the school in the past couple of years. Valencia, at the time that I was involved in the school, was really so new that it was hard to say that it would be hard for me to identify any group or any particular person as being Valencia. That may still be true, as a matter of fact.
One problem that was pointed out to us when we were taking the tour is that there is no really room where all the students at one time can gather for any certain function.
Well, in the main gallery you can.
Oh, in the open space.
Yeah.
Yeah, but do you envision then that's where, like I was thinking for a theatrical performance, given as, you know, the students, as you say, in fifth year who are very good actors are putting on a performance and they were going to sell tickets to it or something like that and invite the public in, you're expecting 1,500 people or something. Was that not enough of a, well, what was
Well,
the
that
response?
comes into an interesting problem when you get into whole theater programming, and that is that how good can theater be with 1,500 seats? How good a theater can it be? Now, the farther you get a person away from a stage, the less he's able to communicate. And that's why TV is so meaningful now, is that you can come in close to an actor and you can reach 10 million people. You can see everything in his face is seeing. So early on, the decision was made that there would be no desire for any theater larger than 800 seats in the school. That there wasn't any economic reason in terms of ticket receipts to do it, and there were lots of reasons why smaller groups are an advantage. Now, we did dress ourselves to the fact that every once in a while you might want to put everybody together in one space, and that's why the gallery will take 1,200 people. You can put everybody in there. And that wasn't for a theater production as much as it was just a get-together. And incidentally, there is a third phase to CalArts which has an 800-seat theater. Yeah, it's time for me to go, yeah.
Are you pleased with the building as it is? Should I not have
I
asked
tell
that?
you, I couldn't make a value judgment, and I mean this very sincerely. I really couldn't make a value judgment until I let some time go by. I think the real test is to see what happens downstream. You know, at the time you do the best you can, and I don't think any of us ever get to a point where when we start to look back with 20/20 vision, we don't say, well, I would have done it differently. I'm sure I would. And if a life develops in that building and a lot of the potential that I know is there is begun to be utilized, then I could begin to become pleased with it. But that's going to take time, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah,
very
good.
much.
Well, I'm delighted. We didn't
And
digress.
trading all these
Yeah.
details with us while you're involved in this project.
Thank you.
How do I get out of this?
We'll call you back on the jurying of the project.
I'd love to see what you're doing. I'd love to see what you're doing.
Then it'll be your turn to ask the question.
Their sources were whether they were periodicals or going out and doing measurements. It's just because
1.5 times that. And came up for architecture and planning. $160,000 square feet. And then we took the graphic arts and divided it into, call it fine arts, and somewhat separated that up into, you might say, regular drawing classes and ceramics and sculpture, more, what's not contemporary, but traditional art courses. And took the ceramics and sculpture and put them in 5,000 square feet. Ceramics and sculpture. Then there's the drawing, just drawing and painting, just you might say strictly graphic arts, was drawing and painting was another 5,000. And design and
Did you add this, or you just come up with a figure from the student?
we didn't take it divided up into rooms. You know, that could be one.
5,000.
That could be.
So many students.
We just figured about it, we just were dealing with just space.
And yeah, we did deal with students. Like the sculpture and ceramics and sculpture, out of the, 300 people that are in the fine arts department, we figured at a maximum 80 students would be using both of those facilities.
Also the numbers we used only were a tool in coming up with some idea of how much space we would need.
Yeah, well, the
That
reason
was
I
all
wanted
it
the
was
number
there.
is that, say, if I disagree with that, or you rearrange it, I know what figure you use.
Okay.
That's the reason. In other words, you use 80, that's 40 square feet per person.
Right.
So then, you know, if I combine it or something, you get,
Right.
that's why I'm asking.
Okay, the drawing and painting is for classrooms, and that kind of comes up to how many classrooms you feel and whatever size classroom you need for that amount of people. We used
How many did you use? How many classes?
we used a 30 by 40 room.
Okay, we were using, I think we were using 6.
6 30 by 40s, I think.
Okay, just give the unit.
And then we did design and history, and we assumed these were maybe smaller rooms, closer to classroom sizes, and not too many of them. And we came up with 3,000 for design and history. And then studios, and this is maybe the greatest area of in the fine arts, and this comes down to your, I don't know, more flexible spaces or something. The studios for fourth year and graduate students, a 20 by 20 space, and we got this off of both Alexis Smith and what Mort said. Although he's not dealing with an art space, but like he said, he came in and his 2-car garage works great for him. And we were down at Glenn's studio in Venice, and that's a nice space at 20 by 20, about between 4,000 and 500 square feet. And we figured 80 studios to cover everybody in the fine arts. And that comes up with 3,200 square feet. 32,000 square feet. And then there's shops. And for right now, we broke the shops up into, like that architecture figure, that includes, when we multiplied this building and multiplied it up, it included increasing a shop area for the architecture department. And instead of coming up with one shop facility, right now, they're all divided up. You know, you may go back and group them for efficiency, but the shop area for the fine arts was 2,400 square feet. Studios. Shops at, and that's 47,400 square feet total. And then industrial design, mostly just design studios or classrooms, whatever you want to call them, and another shop. And we anticipated some other kind of minimal facilities, in that possibly some of these design facilities would both take place under the architecture department or under the fine arts department, that those would maybe be multiple use, especially in lower division. So the entire industrial design was 8,000 square feet. That's shop and studios. And then music. We took that, the music, performing arts, and the communication arts, and we kind of stopped both at the performing arts and the communication arts because we weren't quite clear on what those areas defined, and especially when it came down to the performing arts as far as facilities. But the music, mostly from Mort's stuff, we came up with 7 studios at 25 by 25, and then 25 more small, like practice booths or something, and those are 10 by 10. And that figure, let's see, the 7 25 by 25 was 4,400, and the 25 10 by 10s was 2,500. Then for all three, the music, the performing arts, and the communication arts, theater facilities are going to be necessary, and we somewhat anticipated a, was it Mummers Theater? How it's laid out, in that there's a main facility and then 2 minor facilities, one minor, one for music, one for performing arts, and then a main theater either for larger productions or for school productions, whatever necessary. And the smaller theaters could be used as practice, large practice studios or practice theaters for any of the performing arts. And that's about as far. We haven't broken down the performing arts and the communication arts into square footage yet, other than kind of some spaces needed, but not square footage yet. And I think that's it. We also came up with the amphitheater outside, approximately a minimum of space necessary for 2,000 people. Not quite sure what that is yet. And then parking for 1,800 students, 300 faculty and staff, and 200 public, which is 2,300 parking. That's a huge parking facility. Pardon? 1,800 for students, and that was based on, there's 2,000 students, all of them living on campus with 40% married, so that's another 800. So that's 2,800 students living on campus, and came up with an 1,800, somewhat arbitrary. And then off of some figures Mort gave us, student ratio, we gave 1 faculty every 10 students to come up with the necessary faculty and staff parking. and then 200 public. And the housing is housing for 300 people, and there's no, that's kind of an individual thing as far as space goes for how many square footage per person. And that's as far as we have it right now. Housing for 3,000 people?
Do the faculty live on campus too? Is that going to be a parameter?
We didn't really deal with that. We didn't consider that, you know, that thing is not holding on.
Seems like if we're going to require the unnatural thing of having 100% of students live on campus, it's for some experiment of having everybody live together or something, you got to have the faculty live there too.
It's up to you. Part of the program was looked at the design student occupancy because it seems over and over again. People seem to choose the option to live off campus if they have a choice. And maybe that's, we got to modify that. I can't see it 100%. Also, to go with this, we look at just for these schools, we came out with, not counting up the housing, commercial facilities, we came out with 259,700 square feet.
That's total.
That's total. Okay. And then we took a figure of $40 a square foot as construction, and it came up by $7.5 million.
That's assuming that everything is a new building.
Right.
But that, wait, does that figure include the theater and all that stuff?
No, I said just for
Just
these
the
schools.
facilities that we've given square footage for.
So there's still the housing, the theater, the
Amphitheater, parking,
parking, and
landscape, and purchasing.
some of the land, just 200.
We did something on this.
Some more figuring on the land cost too. And it's, I'm still not sure what's clear. On the original one I did, I have assessed value and land value. Then there was this whole thing about multiplying it all by 4. So we multiplied it all by 4 and it's a.
Well, I think we agreed last time that some of those figures look like market value.
Some of them are market
Some are
value, and
assessed,
some
and you
are
were supposed to sort of straighten that out.
like, just for instance, the factory across the street, the building that's Beta Cablevision. I mean, if you look at the size of it, it's gotta be worth, $500,000 or $1 million, just the building. And, on the map, it's $100,000. So, there's.
On an overview quickly, it seems like the industrial space is all on assessed value. It seems like a lot of the residential is on market value.
Well, that's what they do. People have been complaining all along.
Why, it comes out last 230 a year, where, how they look at there's a great difference between the way they assess industrial and commercial level. The other question though, before we get into that, we must have areas of disagreement here. How about, let's hear some other input.
I would just disagree with something there. They seem to have the attitude of very traditional.
No, not necessarily. We just use that as basis. Like when we say 6 classrooms to such and such a space, it doesn't necessarily need to be 6 classrooms. We just use that as a way of coming up with square footage.
Just to give us a starting base to work with. There's nothing to work with now. We got to start somewhere.
Well, like on Shopper,
Okay, well, you mentioned that you had that option.
Under each facility, this is how much the architecture department would need, and maybe even if it was a large facility, one thing, the architecture department would use that many benches and saws and stuff out of a large facility. Now that gets into the whole efficiency thing, how you lay it out.
One area that I would like to discuss, because it looks like we have a void in that area, and I'm not sure any of you really know how that particular school works, but you lump architecture and planning as a single element, and we didn't have a planning representative here to discuss, what goes on in most planning schools. Okay. Now, as far as an observation, you could say in an ideal situation, they would be more similar. In other words, planners should be maybe working more as architects are if you're thinking of physical planning operation mainly. If you go to a planning school, and I'm sure if you went over to UCLA, and I know how it was at Cal Poly, the studio space given to planners is not used at all that way. They use this kind of space most of the time. Most of the time they're lecturing, and they only need a certain amount of gathering space periodically, but they would not use near the studio space that architects use. So there's an adjustment right there. I'm sure at UCLA there's probably practically no planning studio space. I can't imagine,
Would they not
because
use it if they had it?
no, it's because the normal planning program, unless we were to say this one is going to be a physical design, urban design oriented planning program, then you might get a completely different orientation. The majority of the planning programs, though, are usually dealing in the physical, in the social sciences with the strong base in political, economic, and those areas. So they do a lot of lecturing. Now at Cal Poly, it was supposed to be a physical design oriented school, but the faculty that they brought on was not physically design oriented, so therefore they had a big studio space equivalent to what we had, and practically nobody ever worked in it. And then they tried to break it down and darken it and separate it out in another way. So I think you should analyze that space slightly differently from the architecture space, and probably think of it in terms of potential for gathering of material and putting things together in large series, but a lot more lecturing and a lot more classroom orientation generally now, unless you want to change the orientation. But that's the way they usually work.
At San Luis Obispo, the first 2 years of planning were the same curriculum as architecture.
Okay, so then we're back into how are you going to work the, same thing at Cal Poly. How are you then going to work, how are you working your curriculum might change. That becomes the hard problem here, because in a sense, again, how the curriculum works makes a big difference on how your school's going to work, and how you're going to house people, and how you're going to deal with all those issues.
Also, we tried to be very liberal as far as their space.
Yeah, this is luxurious.
Well, in the broad base, it isn't bad. I mean, if you took the numbers here, this morning we were given a figure of 300,000 for a school of around 2,000 people. If you took our number here and multiplied it by a factor of 10, but that, of course, you'd end up with 200,000 on a broad range, and so you're right in the middle, maybe that's what you work to as a total. I don't know, but you're rather generous here, which is always the case. I think probably, but but probably by comparison to others, and I think it's a criticism architects usually get. Every time an architect designs a combined building, it's always, the artists and sculptors are all bitching because they're always in the worst place, right? And they can never work it in, and the architecture space is, very, very, very large. So,
You got to read on the Yale thing. It was
Right.
documented, wasn't it?
right. No, there was a big bitch. But then, then, of course, the gal Alexis again, came in and kind of tended to force you downward, I think, in your space. So that's another thing, whether you're going to provide as much. So that, but then if you were to, once this happens, then there's always a complaint from the other departments, right, Frank? I mean, you read it time and again in a crit, and you probably read through maybe some of these I don't know how much you've been reading in the material that was pulled out of the library already, but quite often if you get into a critique, it's usually it'll happen that way, that there's sort of an overemphasis in one area. So
The architecture and the planning, just in the numbers of people, is twice as much as, the other.
Yeah.
And I think we tried to keep somewhat consistent as far as the space for each individual.
yeah, you're considering everybody working in, obviously, because I would say, in our school, I think we have about 50% working in, wouldn't you say? What, do you know what it is? What is it out of our?
We're really working.
Here. No, I mean, of spaces allotted, we must have, we'll have about 100 spaces allotted, won't we, at least? We ought to do a count just for, So that would show you that, in around, 18,000, 16,000 or so, you could accommodate around 200 on that kind of proportion. Now, if you're going to if you're going to a lot space for 100% usage in studio, then you also should have something in mind on how you're going to change that space if it is not used, and how it could double up in some other manner later. So I think as you get into that, again, I think we've usually seen that to achieve 100% of people working is as hard to achieve as housing. Now, as soon as you cut the if you put 100% housing in, you'll probably get 100% working in. If you pull the housing out, I think you'll find the same relationship take place. The people who work here are usually the people close by. The people who live away and commute in don't work here usually. And that's sort of been what we've seen happen here. So I would guess in the same way, and that's why partly this 100% was thrown in. If you house 100%, then the potential for that of working is greater. Of course, you also haven't accounted for the fact that some of that could be doubled up space, depending on how you worked your housing, depending on what you do. But you're looking at it broadly with the idea that you could pull back if you thought you could be more economical. I don't know. Did other people have other areas or other questions? Those are the ones that bother me. The what?
Somehow my gut tells me that's very light, and that there'll be more physical sciences than math in any space. Maybe there's some other even. That's why I started with curriculum. I don't really figure out that that's going to be.
What do you don't have numbers on that?
No, I'm just dealing with
depends on how many classes.
Spaces and things like that. I was thinking that if this is intended to be, at least back to the question about rebranding or the traditional sense of what the services are going to be offered, what possibilities are going to be offered, that the social sciences alone, the various disciplines, sociology, psychology, and political science, things like that, if they were presented all, they might use up all 6 spaces right off the bat.
Now, a lot of those spaces that were, like, we teach math here, so when we go to the architecture department, that included math courses for architecture department.
But also, too, that's happening, that's maximum, the 6 happening at one class time. 10 to 12 or something. That's 150 students that, can use that space.
How do we want to deal with that? Are we going to are we going to have people who can choose either way? The idea of a social science pool that pulls into the areas and then or the building. I mean, are you going to work that?
I kind of think that this almost should be done like Frank suggested, and that we can maybe come to certain agreements about space, so that when we get into choosing how much area we're going to use, we can at least start working with the same boundaries. But that all these things, I mean, as far as like in the design, you might find that something clicking is going to come out better. That maybe your social sciences, physical sciences are actually out mobile units that are traveling around, visiting historical monuments, structures, and that they don't necessarily need a space that big on campus. I think that in the program it should be written that way.
In other words, you'd like to work a base where this is so that everybody isn't battling with these numbers for 10 more weeks, that we accept some kind of a base for the beginning. And then we all agree to that, and then from that point on, then you make your adjustments on your own as you feel strongly. And as your scheme changes, so does your numbers maybe change. And so may your economics change, so that we don't zero in one way, right? Anybody strongly opposed to that?
What were you saying now?
I'm just saying that we tend to accept, not necessarily this, because I think now you should be digesting this between now and Friday. We'll throw all these up again on Friday, and we'll go at it. All I'm saying is maybe we go at it again. We develop a basic framework. So we end up and we know we're dealing with 250,000 square feet or 300,000 or 200,000 square feet, roughly allotted in this way, that we sort of accept for a base. But once you start to work with your problem, that we will allow adjustments in those areas depending upon how you see it. And if as you go into it, you see a way you can cut out 50,000 square feet, make your curriculum work, and you want to knock it out, you knock it out, you know, as a part of the system. Because otherwise, if we accept them, then of course, then you're accepting the premise of the curriculum too. So some of you are going to want to make those changes. But as Frank said, and I want to reiterate this one, because I've been victimized by it for many years. When you get into programming, the reason I don't like it to be too broad is that students start to spend all the, you know, you'll spend another 6 weeks screwing around on the finite points of the programming rather than really getting into the issue of the design of the building, which is really what we're here to do. And so I don't want you to start getting into that to the point that it gets ridiculous, but I do, as he says, and I agree wholeheartedly there, if you have a strong attitude that changes that, and your design attitude that changes these numbers, I think that's more valid than monkeying around trying to equate these out, you know, very finely before you get going, because you'll find when you get going, you're going to change them probably anyway to some degree. So, is that, do you agree with that? Or,
I think the individuals point of view, I'm going to let you know what my point of view is probably valid. And I don't intend to sit back and say, well, I got it all figured out. You know, I probably have it designed already. And which way it should go and so on. And you'll probably know about it very quickly. And I hope you just, I don't intend to play games about that. I don't think Ray is either. You're going to know that we have points of view, but I'm really personally going to be very up on somebody who takes his own strong position and lets his own point of view show through. Even if I disagree with it, and I may scream and holler at you. I mean, you know, I may just fight you to the draw on that conventional versus, you know, and what art is, but that doesn't mean I'm going to penalize you in any way for taking a position. In fact, I'll champion you for doing it.
Did you go any farther in trying to apply this overlay
No, we didn't, because that comes into that whole thing of, you know, when you save buildings, when you level the whole thing, whether you don't build another building. Right.
Maybe we should talk about it.
yeah, I don't, well,
That's a very
go ahead.
Well, in working out some of the areas. Take this thing with.
I'm good here.
And coming up with some of our areas, as far as how much it would cost in like little clumps or blocks, I don't know, I really question as far as how much area we're going to use and how much is really usable area. As far as I'm concerned, is looking around the site, this section, Drescher, the area Drescher owns, and the buildings that are down here are, you know, they're usable spaces. Now, I don't know how much square feet, you know, is going to, if that's enough square footage for us to, you know, house our school. But Doug made a strong point last night that, you know, then it starts getting into a weird trip and what, you know, vernacular are you going to start keeping as far as adding on new buildings, or new structures or new facilities.
We end up with, if you pick these buildings, which in this particular site are crammed over against this one side, then are you stuck with a vernacular, a street grid, a house grid, and everything that dictates the rest of the problem? Maybe it doesn't, but it might. And, you know, the more restraints you have, supposedly the easier it is to design, but maybe not.
That's an open question.
Or are we going to leave again the choice up to everybody of what buildings they want to keep? Or are we going to call any of these buildings such sacred? So in other words, are we saying that we have to keep our building and we have to keep the old Winfield China building and those two, and then everything else will go down? Or are we going to say, you know, we make our own choice? I think some people will.
Is that your choice?
No,
I want to know your choice.
But, you know, as some people have asked me, can the whole thing be a total rehab? And I said yes to that. I mean, if everybody, if one wanted to use rehab for the whole process, that's okay. But they felt they could do the best job of the school through that process. And economically, it was valid. And then I also threw back the question, if you were the architect and the economics were more equal, would you save the building or take it down? I think those are the issues you kind of deal with. Most architects always take the position. If it's close, they'll usually take it down. However, that, I'm starting another building, but that isn't necessarily where you have to be.
That plan has changed.
Right. There are those who, and it wasn't set up to be a rehab problem either, at least it wasn't in my head, but in somebody else's head, it might be totally. But I would assume that part of it could be rehab because there are some very valid spaces here. But then, as Ken said, then how do you plug that? But that's a problem that an architect has with space.
Well, there's a,
Anyway, I haven't learned everybody's name.
Okay, Bill.
if we take it, the economic thing, whether you save this building or not, doesn't it question the whole site? Isn't that why CalArts ended up out in the sticks? Is because they couldn't afford to build in the center of the city.
Well, also donated land.
Yeah.
Joshua will donate his land.
For $1 million.
I don't know, I would vote that nothing is sacred and that it's up to the individual to save those buildings, but I do feel that we should allocate a certain area, redefine our buildable area so that it, we start working with somewhat of the same framework.
Why? I mean,
That whole area is built.
now what if a guy doesn't want to save anything, goes down and picks up the empty lot down there as his beginning, unless we have a traffic thing, which we talked
Well,
about.
the traffic I don't think is that
Didn't seem to, what did everybody end up with? That we're about equalizing what we're taking out and we're putting it back, or?
We didn't get a traffic on.
No, well, that was last week. We didn't, because we finally looked around and said, well, somebody's supposed to in the class. Didn't anybody? Check how many people were right in the area as it was, how many, if we replaced everybody, how many would we be putting in, and would that change the traffic count,
There's approximately.
I have the traffic count, and it's,
No, but I mean, how many people are living
There's
there
approximately 5,000 people
right now?
live in the area right now. That's little kids and everything, dogs,
You're
cats.
not gonna replace them all.
No,
I'm really down.
no, I'm not saying you
If you're
are.
going to, if anything, in a city, the tendency is towards an increase of density.
You're-
And that you have to figure on that 2,000 or so meters.
Added to it, is that what you're saying? Well, I don't know, it depends on your solution.
And then
If you go in and
that's-
wipe out all the housing, you're gonna have a different situation. So
Well,
it,
I was hoping the traffic I would come in, because if we do increase it by 2,000 cars, that's enough to get most neighborhoods up into arms. I mean, in Ocean Park, if they tried to put in a housing development that brought 2,000 cars in, they'd have the whole neighborhood stopping for
But you're-
illegal means they could have.
You're assuming that all those 5,000 people are still going to live in here.
Well,
You just worked off the vacant
it's kind of
lots, you'd be bringing in
self-defeating
people.
to say you're gonna
Those two
put a
streets.
school in the center of the city, and then kick all those people to the outside of the city.
it looks like it's gonna be an individual problem. I think it would be better bringing the traffic consultant as we get into it, because some of you are gonna possibly create problems, and some of you are not, and those that are gonna create problems probably should be looked at as a group, because if you're keeping all the 5,000, adding to, and you add it in a position where it crowds the streets that are now existing, then you'd have to take another look. So you might have to, depending on how you're approaching it, you'd have to look at your own problem,
Yeah,
Because
well,
some
it needs to
people
be
here may
involved.
be wiping out the whole neighborhood. I don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, we just haven't talked about that at all. It gets to be very typical to any neighborhood situation now. You're bringing in 2,000 people. It's the same as if you would overbuild or start building in Ocean Park or any neighborhood now. The issue is always you're bringing 2,000 more people into our neighborhood. How's the streets going to handle it? And we haven't talked about it. That's why I was
It's 3,000 people too.
3,000 people.